About 2 years ago, Catherine Jordan came to me and said, Kelly, we need an environmental action group at FUS, and I've got some energy to organize around it. And so together we convened a group of folks that have been meeting regularly, a growing group, now also with leadership from Amy Dreyer, creatively finding ways to engage our congregation for action to save our planet. From the beginning, we've called ourselves the Climate Justice Team, with an equal emphasis on climate and justice for all people. This is our second Earth Day event, and that means our second online Earth Day event. We look forward to the time when we can host this together in person. It is our pleasure to welcome today Dr. Sam Grant as our guest speaker. Sam's role in the environmental justice movement began in 1983 in Minnesota, when he fought for his college campus to divest from South Africa and worked as a lobbyist for passage of legislation demanding that A, workers have a right to know about the dangerous chemicals being used or produced in their workplaces, and B, that communities have a right to know about the hazardous chemicals used or produced by companies in their neighborhoods. Along with James and Grace Lee Boggs, Sam did a workshop on environmental racism in Chicago in 1986, and ever since then has been organizing creative solutions that emerge from within communities to define our paths to liberation. Sam is now executive director at MN350, an organization leading Minnesota's fight against climate change and leading from the intersectionality of racial and climate justice. At MN350, Sam is leading and supporting work on multiple fronts to move all of Minnesota onto a just transition pathway. Welcome to First Unitarian Society, Sam Grant.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm really honored to be in circle with all of you who are here this morning. When my father, who had the last couple of tickets to a Paul Robeson concert in North Carolina, found out that my mother was very much seeking to have one of those final tickets, he said, "You can have it as long as you will be my date." So she was his date. They ended up getting married. And as they got married, my mother required that my father find a church, because unless he had a spiritual path to go along with his commitment to evolution of humanity, their marriage would not work. And so my father found his home in the Universalist Society, first in Florida, and then wherever we moved in the country. And when we lived in Minnesota, he was in your congregation at First Universalist for a time. So I'm in many ways back home, because he would bring me with him on some of those occasions on Sundays. So welcome, and thank you for taking time to sit with me this morning. I begin with a meditation to say their names. Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, George Floyd, Dante Clark, Jojo Boswell, Sheila St. Clair, Rose Downwind, and the many others whose lives have been senselessly, unjustly taken by law enforcement and also by a predatory society that devalues the lives of Indigenous women and girls. We also need to say the numbers. We are at 417 parts per million of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, and we need to get back to 350. In the last 7 or 8 years, nearly 2,000 African Americans have had their lives taken, stolen, destroyed by law enforcement officials. And over a slightly longer period of time, over the last 40 years, that same number, nearly 2,000 Native women and girls have gone missing or been murdered in their communities in Minnesota and around the country. We need the numbers of Native lives lost and Black lives lost from today forward to go to zero, from here to infinity. As we consider how to best counter the climate crisis, I'm reminded of an African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. There are many who assume that the climate crisis is so severe we have to act with all due haste using technology and market-ready solutions to bring down greenhouse gas emissions and make all else wait until after we have solved that crisis. I ask you to remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to us and his demand and articulation that why we cannot wait. We cannot wait for justice any longer. We have waited too long already. We cannot have justice for Blacks without wronging whites, so zero-sum thinking says. We cannot end patriarchy without hurting men, so this pathological way of thinking goes. We cannot slow the pace of greenhouse gas emissions in order to focus resources on climate reparations, because that would destroy the economy. We cannot raise the social cost of carbon to include the cost of climate injustice, because that would be too expensive. In his time, Martin Luther King Jr. believed that we could help society move forward with loving evolutionary pressure. I agree with him, and I think we need to combine now, given the urgency of the intersectionality of racial justice and climate justice in our time, as we witness the senseless mass killings all across this country, plus the escalation, the continuation of anti-Black violence and anti-Indigenous violence, as represented by Line 3 and the number of Native women who have been sexually violated by workers in northern Minnesota who are bringing that pipeline through. We need to now stop assuming that degeneratively designed systems can be corrected with simple pressure. We need to open our radical imaginations, and we need to embark on the invention of new models of democracy, of markets, of science, and education that foster mutual liberation. The philosopher Edgar Morin and the physicist Albert Einstein both had ways of saying that the challenge for humanity is to correct errors in thought before they generate devastating errors that spread across humanity. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, while it minimized the severity of the ecological crisis, it did succeed in recognizing that 15 of 24 core ecosystem services were in significantly degraded status, and that we were running out of room for life with our pattern in civilization. The work of many great scientists since then has added to this with recognition that we're exceeding certain biospheric limits. We've gone over the boundaries for climate integrity, over the boundaries for biodiversity loss, over the boundaries for nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. We believe that in this climate generation of 2020 to 2050, it is mandatory to do all of the following. 1, learn to think interculturally, ecologically, democratically, and transformatively in relation to all systems and worldviews. 2, as you develop this transdisciplinary, intercultural, and integral knowledge, share it with everyone in your life and humbly invite them to share the knowledge they are developing alongside you. 3, engage everyone we know, every organization and system we are a part of, in envisioning and enacting just transition pathways. 4, do not prioritize yourself. Prioritize those who are most affected by the climate crisis. 5, in order to do that, you have to begin to build enduring relationships directly with those in most affected communities, and you have to follow their leadership, which means directly investing in the dreams of the most affected communities and supporting them collectively. To secure systems change, not climate change, we need collective change, not just individual level change. We have to face intractability with revolutionary pressure, unrelenting revolutionary pressure. We have to democratize climate science and climate justice intergenerationally. We have to recognize the relationship between economy, culture, ecology, and put ecology and culture first. This means putting the basis of our shared existence and our deepest shared values first. To put our deepest shared values first, we have to struggle to develop those shared values and not assume we know them and embody them yet in the present. Vandana Shiva articulated eco-apartheid as the division of humanity from nature, of the division of humanity amongst ourselves by virtue of race, class, gender, borders, religion, and many other forms of division. And then the internalization of those forms of division inside our own mind and heart and spirit and way of being, so that we become socially reproductive of a divisive world instead of a mutual world. My great friend and ancestor now, the poet Kirk Washington Jr., often started his living room gatherings in North Minneapolis by saying, "We already know how to be divided. What I need to know, what we need to know, is how can we really come together?" Desmond Tutu echoed this sentiment as well as he thought about articulating climate apartheid, building on the logic of the chief negotiator for the group of 77 developing countries and for the whole continent of Africa, Lumumba Diaping, who in 2009 at the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen said very clearly that the agreement reached that privileged the interests and concerns of the global North was a suicide pact for the global South. And he said it was unconscionable for nations of the global South to allow this agreement to go forward. And that reckoning that sort of catalyzed a global mass of energy in 2009 helped to push the climate justice movement to a new level of articulation. And it was 2 years later that MN350 was born, somewhat coming out of the energy of that 2009 recognition that we had to fight for climate integrity by fighting for climate justice. All of you with privilege can take solace that whatever version of the Thrive Agenda or the Green New Deal emerges through the Biden administration and beyond, you'll get some benefit, protection, and comfort and opportunity through that. But we have to think beyond ourselves and begin to think about the people who are invisible to us. There is a hidden cost to all that you have, and it has been imposed on those you cannot see, on those you do not know, and on those whose importance you have blindly treated as less valuable than your own. It is time to count the full cost of carbon and to pay climate reparations as though our own lives depend on it. How do we count? How far back do we go in our reparations accounting? Climate reparations is not about casting blame and spreading shame, but it is about counting the cost and stopping the hemorrhaging. Climate reparations invites us to come to mutual understanding of how to promote a future that best fosters mutual thriving for all of life. We cannot figure that out if we do not talk to each other. And we cannot do that if we privilege the pace, the pattern, and the processes of existing systems. I want to describe briefly how we're doing this work at MN350. We've got an amazing staff. Andy is doing tremendous work leading our Line 3 work to stop the tar sands pipeline. Betsy is in the back office as our bookkeeper, making sure that we're continually improving our financial management. Brett is leading our communications work and ensuring that the world knows what is happening through our movement building work. Danielle, who used to be on staff doing political action work, is now playing an administrative role, taking the role that Noah held as our administrative manager and relieving the back office burden on myself and Kate. Gayatri is developing a healing justice strategy, both internal and external to our organization. Jenna has joined our team to work with Andy to amplify our capacity in the Line 3 fight. Grant is doing innovative work to advance Minnesota's role in the divestment movement. Lisa, who has been an amazing volunteer, has come on to coordinate food systems work through MN350. Maddie is expanding the work of our clean transportation team, now with new money raised to include a transit riders canvas and organize the voice of those who rely on public transportation to make their lives work, to be a leading voice in bringing down the cost of transit on them and to distribute that cost more fairly. Misty has developed a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives campaign and now organized with 4 women to put together a transformative justice strategy led by Native women and girls. Nancy, who has been leading work to build a leadership base of Native women in northern Minnesota and also advance treaty rights as necessary for all Minnesotans, is now working with me to link Leech Lake, Red Lake, White Earth, and Bemidji and Beltrami County in dialogue about how to enact a just transition pathway in northern Minnesota. Nicole is coordinating our welcome events and organizing our leadership training strategies. Noelle is doing policy work and coordinating legal defense for people who are being arrested on the front lines in the Line 3 fight. Sarah, who was an amazing volunteer, is now working with Brett in our communications team to expand our capacity to tell the evolving stories in the climate movement. Sophia, who is one of the founders of Black Visions Collective, is now on staff leading our Midwest regional organizing work to build a campaign that brings all of the Midwest together to fight for climate justice. Ula has transitioned from her eco team role to now doing Green New Deal work, which is bottom up, focused on working with constituencies in communities most impacted by the climate crisis to articulate how we enact from the base communities in society just transitions. We are now in the midst of a strategic planning process, and I am seeking to see all of Minnesota move along just transition pathways. By the end of 2022, I would like to see every Minnesota community define and begin to operationalize a just transition pathway that defines how they will bring down greenhouse gas emissions by reorganizing our relationships to center transformative justice and mutual thriving. How can we promote a future that does the following? 1, foster land justice for BIPOC farmers who have been starved of land tenure by rural real estate racism and a history of refusing to lend and then lending only on predatory terms when we do. 2, economic justice in the economy to eradicate the gendered and racialized division of labor. Throughout all of Minnesota history, the unemployment rate for Blacks and Indians has always been minimally double the unemployment rate for whites, and the poverty rate has always minimally been 3 times or more the poverty rate for whites. 3, educational justice by transforming our educational system to teach all histories so that we can actually think on mutual terms. Our educational system fails to help us think on mutual terms in its current form. Ecological justice by ensuring that all human behavior honors the well-being of all life and that we actively repair our relations in order to advance climate integrity. Environmental justice to ensure that development no longer means advancing well-being, even luxury, in some places at the direct and indirect expense of life and well-being in other places deemed throwaway places full of throwaway people. Treaty justice by honoring all treaties and committing to accept obligations to conciliation with Native nations and people here and everywhere. And I use the word conciliation rather than reconciliation because we have not yet begun to practice good human relations. Gender justice, so that there is never again acceptance that men ought to be allowed to lead, to have power and control over women's bodies and choices anywhere in world ecology. Transgender justice, so that we no longer accept blinding binaries that distort the complexity of who we are, how we live, who and how we love. The human rights paradigm brought many of us to believe in a future without war and with common prosperity. Why didn't it work already? And why won't it work in the future? We are not only related to each other through our nations and through the global marketplace of financial flows and ideas, we are related to each other in a much deeper way. To relate through nations and markets is transactional. It is time to transform our relationships by honoring each other from a deeper place within ourselves. As the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa, Abhalali Basin Jondolo calls us to a revolutionary Ubuntu, and as James and Grace Lee Boggs called us to a revolution in values, it is time to go beyond merely recognizing others as having rights merely rhetorically. It is time to join with the Aboriginal artist and social worker Lila Watson, as she said, if you've come here to help me, go away. But if you've come here because you recognize your liberation is inextricably bound with mine, then let's get to work. On what basis does a human being come to understand himself as a relative to all of life? It only comes through living in such a way. Indigenous people and traditional cultures live this way. The rest of us are increasingly individualized and isolated, especially during this pandemic. Minnesota has a long history of being among the worst places to live if you are Black and Indigenous. The homeownership rate for whites is 75%. That for Blacks is 27%. For African immigrants, it's even lower at 23%. The unemployment is always higher for Blacks and Indigenous people. The incarceration rate is like 27-1. Our lives are cut short by environmental injustice, which manifests through health disparities, which emerge through structural racism. We are living through a time of police murder, mass shootings, political intractability, and the justification of containment and detainment strategies is part of a necessary national defense strategy. So we think it to be necessary. A structurally violent world ecology will never midwife harmony. But people around the world, as we come increasingly to recognize our inextricably bound fate, we can midwife harmony and mutuality in world ecology. We cannot assume political cycles will ever move fast enough to do it. We cannot assume corporate innovators will come to save the day. We cannot assume civil society can exercise its noble heart and make sufficient change. We have to assume that the future is in our collective hands and hearts. We have to believe in ourselves and in each other, that we are each other's relative, even when not each other's direct keeper. The honor of one is the honor of all, just as the hurt of one is the hurt of all. Living by the precautionary principle is right, but it is not enough. We need to commit to stop causing harm and prevent harm from being caused. At the same time, we have to understand how and why we have come to live in a world that allows so much violence and destruction. Beyond understanding, we must invest our co-creative energies in fostering convivial co-evolution. I know this may sound a little flowery and poetic and not tangible enough. So let me get a little more concrete. Police murder of Black lives needs to be abolished forevermore. We cannot allow excuses for why systems are so hard to change. We make those systems, and they will change when we make them change. By measuring what matters, we challenge ourselves to feel what must be felt and do what must be done. In an environmental justice dialogue just last week, somebody brought to me this idea. Imagine if, instead of taxpayers paying the cost when a police officer unjustly murders and takes a Black life, that instead of taxpayers paying the cost, it comes out of the police pension fund. That would give police a direct incentive to stop the violence. What if a company could not exist unless it fully embodied the natural step principles completely and consistently? The natural step principles say that a sustainable society means that nature is not subject to increases in concentrations of substances from the Earth's crust, concentrations of substances produced by society, degradation of nature by physical means in that society, and that people are not subject to conditions that systematically undermine their capacity to meet their needs. This brilliant framework includes 5 steps. What it doesn't include is the necessity of a transformation of our worldview together. What is missing is the direct, democratic, and intercultural engagement of those most affected by the crises. We will not solve the climate crisis with experts in the lead. We will only solve the climate crisis with an integral, intercultural, ecological democracy at all scales with most impacted communities in the lead. If we imagine if we are organized so that the economy went to zero waste, zero carbon sourcing, zero imperialism, and zero colonialism. Imagine if the forests of Minnesota, the soils of Minnesota, the prairies of Minnesota, and the wetlands of Minnesota were all restored to their full ecological integrity. and that our commitment to protect our natural resource heritage incorporated both ecological and environmental justice rather than colonialism and white supremacy. Imagine if we took the next 6 months to do a thorough participatory assessment of all our systems and diagnosed every pattern that lacked climate justice integrity. Imagine that we then took what we learned through this process and operationalized just transition pathways for every single Minnesota community, every single Minnesota family, every single Minnesota region. Imagine that we invited the whole world to then join us in this work. What would be possible that's not possible now by 2030? What have we not yet imagined and enacted? From where I sit or stand, I do not see sufficient climate justice ambition. To be radical simply means to focus on what matters as though it really matters. It is time to be radical. The radical path is the path that braids racial justice as climate justice, and therefore braids climate integrity with human relational integrity. I'm not asking or demanding that you join me here. My hand is on my heart and on yours. I feel a better us, a greater us, ready and willing to emerge. I call us to our greater mutual selves. It is time to end eco-apartheid and cooperatively midwife an intercultural ecological democracy at all scales. I'm not asking you to jump into this with me without me taking my own risks. I am actively innovating through MN350 to do many things to bring alive a future worth having for all of life. And I simply can't get there without your loving and brave and co-creative energy and full commitment. And we can't get there unless we each commit to bring everyone we know and everyone we come to know along with us in this movement, the movement of our lives in this climate generation. And I thank you very much for your time.
Oh, Sam. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you for giving us this frame as we imagine our ambition for radical change for climate justice, for land justice for BIPOC farmers, economic justice, educational justice, ecological, environmental, treaty justice, gender justice, transgender justice. You really showed us how all of these things come together to change this worldview that has caused so much devastation and destruction and loss of life. Thank you. Thank you. Connecting our deepest values and the planet's deepest need is a lifetime of work, and it's worthy work as you call us for just transition pathways. We're so glad that you will be with us for the Talk of the Talk breakout room during our coffee hour. And I want to remind everyone that our Clean Up Our Act MN event begins at 1 p.m. and you can watch it at mnearthday.com. You don't have to register or sign up. It'll be streamed live there, and that link has been put in the chat. And then on Thursday, April 22nd, Earth Day itself at 6 p.m., join our watch party for the story of plastic. Thank you to all the FUS Climate Justice team for your work in bringing today together. You call us to action, you give us specific actions to take, and you give us hope.